Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Common Carp Research and Management panel. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this group discussion. The four MACERC researchers that you're about to hear from are all working at the cutting edge of carp control and eradication research. And one of the main reasons we've brought this group together is to help you envision what an integrated pest management approach to common carp might look like. Integrated Pest Management, or IPM, is a science-based approach to managing invasive species or agricultural pests. And in the field of invasion biology, an IPM approach requires a detailed understanding of the life history of the target organism, how it's interacting with and impacting its invaded environment. And it also means deploying a suite of different management approaches that can be applied at different time periods and sometimes in combination with each other. IPM generally favors non-chemical approaches, and it requires continual monitoring of the population and the response so managers know which techniques are being applied at the right time and place. Thankfully, MACERC researchers and others have been studying common carp for over a decade, and we now have a wealth of knowledge about their reproductive biology, disease susceptibility, foraging habits, social behavior, and seasonal migration patterns. We have also learned quite a bit about the extent of the damage the species has on aquatic ecosystems and water quality. And so this body of knowledge is helping researchers develop and refine our management tools that exploit their weaknesses and kill the most carp with the fewest impacts to non-target fish and other organisms. So in the next 20 minutes, you're going to hear about approaches that are being implemented as we speak, and some management techniques that are ready to go but need a permitting and regulatory path forward, and some that are still 3 to 5 years out from a potential field implementation. You will also hear some about the human social dynamics and public support for carp management. And what we're hoping to do in this session is to get the conversation going among Minnesota lake managers and residents who are dealing with common carp challenges and get you up to speed with where the research is at. We want you to know how far we've come and what options are on the horizon, because you'll be hearing a lot more from MACERC in the coming months about carp management research outcomes and the possibilities for implementation. So each panelist will introduce himself and the carp research they're engaged in, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. Using the Q&A function that we've been working with most of today, it's down at the bottom of your Zoom window. You'll see a Q&A button. You can enter your questions into that at any point through the session. And we will try to address it as time allows. So that's all I have. You can take it away, panelists. And Amit, we will start with you.
All right, thanks, Meg, for the great intro. And thanks, everyone, for joining us today. I am Amit Pradhananga. I'm a social scientist, a research associate with the Center for Changing Landscapes at the University of Minnesota, and I'm also a MACERC fellow. I do research broadly on the social and human policy aspects of natural resource issues, ranging from invasive species, water management, to climate change. In this particular arena of invasive species, my focus is on understanding the social and human aspects that relate to invasive species management. In particular, I have these couple of interrelated projects that I'm working on right now. The first phase is kind of wrapping up. Prashamik is also working with me on that piece. And in that study, we are assessing public perceptions and public values. So what do the public perceive as benefits of invasive species management from a social, psychological, as well as an economic perspective? So we did surveys with lake recreationists at 4 lakes a couple of years ago, assessing how much people would be willing to pay, how much lake visitors would be willing to pay for invasive species management in general. We also asked questions around, what are the attitudes, awareness about invasive species, and also are they able to identify, which the lake they were at and what species is affecting that lake. We also are wrapping up a survey right now, a general residence survey. So with the recreationists, we're looking at what are these perspectives and the economic aspects for direct users of a lake versus from a general resident, which may include non-regular lake users, what are their perspectives, and what is their level of willingness to pay and public support for different kind of strategies. And then thirdly, we're also doing a survey of Lakeshore residents, which is ongoing right now. And if there's any Lakeshore residents out there that have received the survey, I'd be grateful if you take this survey. We have received about 1,300 responses so far. And so across all of these, we're looking at, how much does the public, the direct user public versus resident public know about invasive species? What is the level of awareness? We're finding that for a large majority of Minnesotans, invasive species, aquatic invasive species, is seen as a problem that does need addressing. We're seeing that people do perceive different kind of risks from invasive species to ecosystem services like habitat and economic impacts that are related to invasive species. And we're also seeing that people value these positive outcomes or benefits that we can get out of managing invasive species. And I can talk, when we get questions, a little bit more about that end of the research as well and the economic aspects around that. And then the second phase, then we are focusing on a particular type of stakeholder. So we're focusing on tourists and tourism industry and trying to assess what are some perceived impacts of invasive species on the tourism industry, how prepared are businesses to adapt to any potential changes, how might tourists respond to any impacts of invasive species, would they go to a different lake, and what kind of impacts we can understand and perceive out of invasive species impacts on lakes in particular. So we'll be doing more surveys again next year. We'll be reaching out to businesses to do some focus groups, get sort of a qualitative understanding of how businesses might adapt to and respond to invasive species issues. And then we'll also be doing a broader business owner survey to have more of a quantitative assessment of those impacts. And I think I'll kind of leave it at that, and I can expand on these research areas a little bit more as we start getting questions.
Thank you, Amit. Next up, we have Shemek.
Hey, Meg, how much time do I have?
If you keep it around 5 minutes.
Okay, that's great. So Shemek Bajor, research assistant professor at MASERC. And for those of you who missed my talk an hour ago, I also am the owner of Carp Solutions, which is a U of M spin-off company. And I work with Common Carp. I've been working with Common Carp since 2006, so it's been a while. And started in Peter Sorensen's lab as a postdoc and then on my own. We sort of went through this whole process of trying to develop integrated pest management approaches for carp, sometimes borrowing from existing ideas and sometimes developing new ones. And I guess in the process, we accomplished a few things. One is we were able to document the life history of common carp in Minnesota, especially in the central Minnesota lakes, and that really allowed us to develop strategies to control carp in these types of ecosystems. We identified several interesting behaviors such as spawning migrations to winter kill prone lakes that the carp need to produce young in this area of central Minnesota. We worked on seasonal aggregations under the ice to develop or to really show how those could be removed. And that's been done for decades actually by commercial fishermen. We have developed the management threshold for carp populations so that the managers know how many carp is too many in a lake. And that was based on whole lake experiments. We have developed rapid assessment methods where boat electrofishing can be used to quickly assess if the carp biomass in the lake is too high and how many carp need to be removed. Some biocontrol methods that use native fish to control carp eggs and larvae, bluegill sunfish. And let's see, really few different aspects of the IPM strategy that can be put together to control carp populations. And, you know, those are, like I was saying, the physical removal methods, like using radio tags to track carp aggregations under the ice and remove them, using bait to form feeding aggregations in the summer and remove those with specialized nets. Then tracking spawning migrations of adult carp between lakes and using different types of barriers and guidance systems, including electric guidance systems and, you know, conveyors to remove those migrating carp, often with not that much labor. We've been working with a lot of local governments, watershed districts, lake associations, to start testing those different IPM approaches and ideas. And several of them have been successful. Some of them have started, you know, a long time ago in 08, 09 in Riley, Purgatory Bluff Creek Watershed District and Phelan Chain. And those have been largely successful, which illustrated that the IPM is actually possible. So I think we have a lot of the bits and pieces together, how to control carp populations. And we're also continuously improving those different management methods. And I think from my perspective, the way I see it is, I think we're lucky that carp really have these sort of interesting attributes like learning abilities and seasonal migrations and social aggregations that allow us to control them very selectively. And I think that the future will be in increased automation to make those removal strategies, you know, really modern and efficient and species selective.
Okay, thank you, Przemek. That was a great overview of the huge suite of tools we have available for physical removal methods. Our next two researchers are going to be talking about projects that are more in the pipeline, genetic and pathogenic biocontrol. So Mike, you're next.
Great, thanks, Meg. So my name is Mike Smansky. I am a professor in the Biotechnology Institute in the Biochemistry Department at the University of Minnesota. And I am a self-professed non-carp expert. So I've learned a ton from interacting with people like Przemek and Nick over the years. We've been working on a carp project for the past 3 years. And but my lab is definitely more of a genetic engineering, DNA reprogramming specialist lab than we are a carp lab. We work with carp, we work with other fish, we work with plants, insects, a lot of microbes, bacteria, and yeast. And we're expert at being able to examine the genome of an organism and rationally manipulate that genome by rewriting different sections. We can introduce transgenes, we can delete genes that are in the genome to affect the behavior of those organisms. And so for invasive species control, this actually has a bunch of different applications. From one sense, you can use those tools just to interrogate the biology of the invasive species. And I'll mention this, I think, later on in the conversation, but there's a lot of opportunities for using these tools to better understand the aspects of the carp genome that influence things like chemical control or physical control or aggregation, et cetera. But you can also use these genome rewriting capabilities to engineer the pest organism, in this case, common carp, to become a pesticide, where an engineered common carp male, for example, could be released into a body of water and spread deleterious genes into that population to decrease the population in that body of water. And so in the first phase of MACERC funding that wrapped up last year, my lab developed the ability to genetically manipulate carp. We're one of a few groups in the world that can do this now. And in the next phase of research, we're going to be leveraging this capability to test bed a few different types of genetic biocontrol in common carp. So I'll leave it at that for now and pass the baton to Nick, who will introduce himself.
Thanks, Mike. And we already had a question about coy herpes virus being used to manage carp. So I suspect this question will be answered right now.
So I can touch on it and come back to it in a bit here. Hi, everybody. I'm Nick Phelps. I've been working on a project that I'll describe briefly here for quite a while. It's been about a 7-year effort so far, one of MASORC's very first projects. I began this work when I was in the College of Veterinary Medicine here at the U. So during the course of this work, I've changed positions from the fish guy in a health school to a health guy in a fish school. And I've sort of taken perspectives from both of these different groups that I've been working with to really inform the way we've approached this problem. Because when you think about what keeps populations in check in their native range, something that's usually high up on that list are pathogens, disease. So that has long been a strategy of invasive species managers to try to harness pathogens for biological control. And this has happened in many times, insect systems, insect pests for agricultural purposes or environmental purposes, like emerald ash borer, and the use of fungal biocontrol is becoming increasingly of interest. They've tried viral biocontrol for rabbits in Australia for many decades, and it's resulted in millions or billions of dollars of economic savings. Although the species is still out there, it's been a huge benefit to managing that population. So when we started looking here at common carp, trying to add another tool to the toolbox, we sort of weighed the pros and cons of looking for a local pathogen or one that might be imported from somewhere else, from their native land. Just from a risk trade-off point of view, I opted to pursue something that was local. If we could find something here and harness it to our advantage, that would be the best case scenario. It would be much lower risk. So we started looking at carp populations specifically for viruses. And we found a lot of different things: picornas, caliciviruses, paramyxos, a long list of new undescribed viruses. And we came across two that were very interesting to us from a biocontrol point of view, and that was carp edema virus and koi herpes virus, or KHV. Now, KHV emerged on the landscape globally in the late 1990s, thought to be spread around the world in the koi trade. Now, koi are just an ornamental variety of common carp. They're just an inbred color variation. So essentially the same species. And this virus, we've learned quite a bit about, given the economic impact to that industry. What we didn't really know what that virus would do, though, in natural settings, a wild population. We've taken this opportunity once we found it to really dive in deep on that particular virus. And a long story short, we've answered questions about mortality rates, transmission, persistence. We know a lot more about the ecology of the virus in wild populations. We're much more confident about species specificity, distribution of the virus in the state. I could go on, and I'm happy to explain some of those in the Q&A if folks are curious. But a long story short, some of the main punchlines where we're at now, we're confident that the virus is fairly widespread in Minnesota in carp populations, that it's highly species specific just to common carp here in the state, and that previously exposed populations so these surviving carp can carry the virus for a long time and become sort of reservoirs for the environmental persistence and shed it when the stars align to naive individuals and cause future outbreaks. So we expect this to continue to induce mortality events in populations once exposed. So where this really leaves us is a recommendation for an augmentative biocontrol strategy, where you can manipulate populations to induce outbreaks strategically at certain points in time to try to take advantage of what's already there. This sort of, it's much safer. It circumvents some of the regulatory challenges that might exist for introducing exotic pathogens. So it's a potential strategy that could be employed here in the state in relatively short order if folks want to harness it in places where the virus is already present.
Okay, thank you, everybody. That was a great introduction. We have 25 minutes for Q&A, so this is great. I think one of the questions was addressed just now by Nick. So we have a question from Bill, who is a bay captain at Harrison's Bay in Lake Minnetonka. They have issues with common carp. Bill wants to know what tools are available to measure the problem in the bay and the attached Jennings and West Arm Bay. And they also have a creek that flows in. So I want to kind of combine this with one of the prepared questions. Maybe Shemek, you can answer this, and perhaps Nick chime in on a potential theoretical application of a pathogen, introduction. Shemek, so how would this walk us through what a project might look like real quickly, like from an assessment, population assessment, to implementation, and then maybe we can just hypothesize about what an integrated approach with pathogens and physical removal might look like in this situation, now that we have a couple specifics about the location and the attached flowages and creeks.
Sure. So I'll just focus on what's already available and what could be used. So to assess the severity of the problem, what we do is, or what others do is boat electrofishing surveys. That takes 3 days and 3 independent surveys. And that will quantify the biomass of carp you have in that area. And based on that, you can calculate how many carp need to be removed, basically by how you need to reduce the biomass. And then the next step usually is trying to figure out what's the easiest way to reduce the biomass and the cheapest way. Often what we do is we implant fish with microchips and see how they migrate. If they migrate to a specific site to spawn, you mentioned some creeks, connections to marshes maybe, that often is the most effective and the cheapest way to remove them, because if they move in large numbers to small creeks, that's the way to get them out. Using the baited nets in the summer, that's another approach that could be used. Another one is using radio transmitters and try to find if they aggregate under the ice, and commercial fishermen can help with removal under those situations. If the area is good for seining, meaning there's no snags on the bottom and such. So there's this is sort of the typical approach that we use in other places. Initial assessment and figuring out what to do, and you have at least 2-3 tools that you can use to address the problem. And all of those are already approved and ready to go.
Yeah, I can add a piece on how pathogen use might fit into that, Shemek. Specifically on the baited netting in the summertime, to take advantage of a virus that might be there, and I'll tell you, we have not, I don't believe, sampled Lake Minnetonka yet to see if KHV is present. I wouldn't be surprised if it was, though, given its sort of widespread distribution. If you wanted to take advantage of the virus already being there, the best thing to do for those nets would be to time them when the water temperatures are permissive for virus replication. So that would be right at that 70, 74 degrees Fahrenheit up to about 78 degrees Fahrenheit. That's when the virus is really going to be raging in the fish population. And to place those baited sites where there will be the greatest opportunity for older fish to interact with younger fish. So as those younger fish migrate back from the spawning habitats, they're likely still naive to the virus. And if they're exposed to those shedding adults during that temperature window, it's your best chance to induce an outbreak. So the fish that don't get harvested out through the baiting method, the fish that eat the bait and swim away, they could be exposed and die later on. So it could be a double whammy strategy if the virus is there.
And there was also a quick question there, how the residents could engage, which I forgot to address. So the residents could engage in baiting the nets, for example, or often we work with residents to find a location for antennas that track the movement of carp between, say, lakes and streams. So basically finding somebody's property where we can put the equipment out safely. to monitor the fish activity. So those are two examples.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and just real quick, there was a follow-up question about ballpark on the cost of the surveys. I think that's probably, I would recommend reaching out to Carp Solutions. There's so many factors, the size and the complexity, but yeah, reach out to Shemek after this panel, and I'm sure he'd be happy to engage. Question here that I have for Amit. So relating to kind of the water quality management and carp removal as a tool for that. So we have all these projects that are land-based to manage nutrients, like rain gardens, nutrient reductions, conservation tillage, and that's all pretty mainstream. And we have lots of funding streams in the state to support that kind of work. But it seems like in-lake nutrient management and phosphorus removal through projects like carp removal are a little less understood, harder to get funding for, and just there's not wide understanding of the value of that. I wanted to know if you, from your work with the grad student, Casey, whose last name I'm forgetting, when she did all that work with watershed district managers, if you have any insights related to those issues. Can't hear you. It doesn't look like you're muted, but I can't hear you. Can anybody else hear Amit? Okay.
Right. Is that working now?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. I think maybe an issue with my headset here. So yeah, that's a really interesting question, especially because I do work in both those areas. One area that's really focused on those land-based, broader land use practices. So anything from like cover crops to more ag-based conservation practice adoption questions. And I think, so there's two things. One is I feel like with more of the land-based conservation practice, that arena, I wonder if there's a more robust kind of policy structure in place. For example, the One Watershed, One Plan, nutrient reduction strategies, those, wider basin-wide or statewide and, multi-state initiatives in place that perhaps provides, more routes for funding in those areas. But also, just learning a little bit more from this research where we reached out to watershed districts primarily to get a sense for what types of carp management strategies they've used in the past, and just a kind of an estimate on how much has been spent on carp management. But also we asked, another subset of how much was spent broadly in water management, which ended up primarily being used of best management practices on the landscape. And one of the things we found that was really interesting was there was a drastic difference in how much was spent on broader land-based management versus, lake-specific carp management. A very small percent of the total spending directed towards that was specifically directed at carp management. Now, this is only a small sample of about 17 watershed districts that said they'd done any carp management in the past decade or so. And then even within that, I think the amount of spending was, the range was pretty huge. There's some that may have spent only a couple $100 on a lake acre basis. Others may have been spending in like 4 or 5 digit figures. I think some of that might have to do with, what is the capacity of the watershed district, both financial capacity and then just also institutional capacity of how much they might be able to spend, how much management they might be able to do, and what strategies they might have been able to use. Unfortunately, with this research, we weren't really able to get data on, we were able to get data on how much was spent total in AIS management, but we weren't really able to get at how much was spent on particular strategies for carp management. So, we weren't able to figure out, if you've done physical barriers and chemical applications, what was kind of the breakdown of the costs for these different types of practices. But I think the big lesson for us was just seeing, and the surprising thing was just seeing the drastic difference in expenditures for carp management specifically versus broader land use management, related to water quality outcomes type of practices.
Okay.
I have a question following up on that, Amit. Can you guys use your data to create a roadmap for other district managers to know how to most effectively spend their money now based on all previous experience?
Yeah, and that's the idea. And one of our colleagues, Lucy, who's unfortunately left, was also working on expanding that data collection effort to include more watershed districts, more SWCDs, expanding that out to across the state to get more data to be able to say link use of different types of strategies to reductions in biomass, for example, to say, okay, here's how much it costs per pound of biomass removal for each of these different types of management strategies, and which one of these would be most cost effective. And then potentially also then be able to weigh that against, in terms of dollar value that people place, the public places on these positive outcomes of management strategies. Then we'll be able to kind of weigh what's the dollar value benefit versus the costs of managing carp in particular. But that's the overall goal. And I think that's an area that needs a lot more research. It's just kind of understanding these different types of direct use values and non-use values of or the benefits that we might get out of managing carp in particular. But also the cost. I think one of the challenges was it was very challenging to get specific costs for how much was spent in year 1, 2, and 3 for strategies A, B, and C. There's oftentimes, depending on who you're reaching out to, it's more easier or more difficult to get.
All right, thank you. Thank you for going into more detail on that. Quick question for Shemek here. Can you just explain what you mean by the management threshold a little bit more? Is that based on biomass or number of individuals or both? And talk about kind of the relationship in like larger individuals in smaller numbers versus more numerous small carp and how those impacts might be different.
Right, so the threshold is based on biomass. It's 100 kilograms per hectare, or about 100 pounds per acre. With that said, though, usually in lakes with not very high carp biomass, you will have large individuals and not that many. And if you see a lot of stunted small carp, that usually means that their biomass is really high and they grow really slow. So these two kind of go hand in hand. But short answer, we don't know all of these nuances, but we think that the biomass-based approach is more appropriate than just the density of carp.
Thank you. Okay, I have a question for Mike here. So when we scale up new technology, and most especially when it's for a conservation project, that process can take a lot longer than managers and the public want to see. But with all this expansion in genetic methods in recent years, including for invasives, do we have reason to hope that these methods for carp management could be scalable and affordable at some point for state agencies and watershed districts? And if so, can you give us a quick kind of overview of what the evolution of that might look like?
Yes, so I can. I appreciate your usage of the word evolution in a genetic biocontrol project. But it's a complicated story. The neat thing is that with genetic biocontrol, you engineer the machine that then makes more of itself, right? Once you have your genetic biocontrol agent, you can just reproduce that in a controlled lab environment, and by feeding them fish food, giving them time, and they're going to reproduce and make more of themselves. So it's the machine that makes itself. The scalability of that, you just need to look at fish stocking programs around the state, right? There's a lot of fish that we have the husbandry worked out so you can create millions of fry a year and put them in lakes all over the state. And that's what a wide scale application of genetic biocontrol agent would look like. You would have a secure facility somewhere producing the genetic biocontrol agent, and then in targeted lakes, those would be released and have an impact. Now, in terms of timing of it, probably some of you on this call and those of you in the audience have heard of the genetically modified mosquitoes being field tested in Florida. Those mosquitoes were available 15 years ago, and it took a long time to go through the regulatory approval process, do a bunch of public opinion surveys to get public backing in the area they want to do the field test. And so with genetic biocontrol, because it is such a new technology, the runway for deployment is long for the initial field tests. And so I don't think genetic biocontrol is going to be available for carp in the short term. But once it is available, I think it could be really impactful. And not only on its own, but being integrated with things like physical or chemical treatment. I think that's going to be the first instances that you see, is using a physical method to draw down the numbers of carp and then doing limited release of a biocontrol agent to get it from 10% all the way to 0. The most exciting thing in the future, though, is leveraging genetic biocontrol to design the control agent to synergize specifically with other methods. So as we know more about carp aggregation behavior or carp receptors that detect hormones or special chemicals, you could imagine using the biocontrol agent to spread a gene through the population that'll make them easier to catch with baits. And so there's a lot of opportunities for synergizing. We're seeing that already in the insect community, because insects are much easier and faster to engineer than long-lived organisms like carp. But I think in the coming decades, we're going to see a lot more of that with other organisms across the tree of life. Okay, yeah, that's pretty exciting. We have a quick question for Nick. Can you just give us an idea, like when there is a KHV outbreak, are there a lot of dead fish floating up? Like what happens to those? How is that nuisance managed?
Yeah, so when I'm talking about an outbreak, what we've seen here in Minnesota and around this region are mortality events on the scale of tens of fish to thousands. So in Cottonwood Lake in western Minnesota, we had an estimated 10,000 fish over a few day period died. In situations like in that case, there was some nuisance control that needed to be done. It's just, it stinks, it's gross, it's a public health hazard. So somebody needs to go out and clean it up. Just like they would need to do with any sort of chemical control or physical removal, you're going to have to figure out how to get rid of the dead bodies. Yep, so that's an important piece of the planning process, of course.
Yeah, for sure. I was going to ask Shemek if you could just put your email address into the chat for folks. There's someone who is just wanting to know more about what lake conditions characteristics you're looking for potential study sites for your next phase of the project. Sounds like you would want to be in touch with this person. So Chris, I'll give you a way to reach out to Shemek. There's a question here about DNR standard surveys and what's reported on Lake Finder. Is that a way to assess the scale of the carp, or is that just sort of saying presence or absence of carp? And I think maybe Shemek, if you want to address this, we kind of touched about the population assessment needs.
Right, I think there's some value in those surveys, but they're not designed for carp. So when we wrote a paper a few years ago that wanted to look at the carp problem across the whole state, we used data from all the DNR surveys. They were kind enough to let us use it. And we were using catches per one gill net as an indicator of carp biomass because there wasn't anything better. But still, those have limited use. And we did experiments in lakes where we basically knew how many carps there were in the lake. And then we tested different methods, and boat electrofishing was the best one. So if you can, that would be my recommendation to use that. I mean, sometimes when you go to DNR data and catches in gill nets or trap nets are very high, then I think it's likely that you have too many carp. But if you really want to find out how many, I think you should follow up with boat electrofishing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll do one more audience question and then wrap up with one or two from me. So we have a question from Bob on Big Sauk Lake. They've got curly leaf pondweed and carp. The question is, are carp providing any benefit in uprooting invasive plants in terms of the kind of weed control? Shemek, I'm guessing maybe that's one you want to handle given your recent research on that.
Well, they will uproot anything. So maybe there is some short-term benefit, but the downside is that the native plants are not likely to establish in those lakes. And actually, Dan Larkin wrote a paper a couple of years ago showing that the invasive plants actually are relatively benefiting from carp population because they're the toughest ones. So they do relatively better than native plants in lakes with carp. So not many benefits from carp uprooting plants.
I know down south, they actually release sterile grass carp to do that to the lakes that are really bad with an invasive plant. But I think it's like you said, Shemek, like the lake needs to be in a really bad state for the carp to do good. But as soon as, as soon as you get it a little bit under control, you want the carp out of there because they're not going to allow for the reestablishment of native plants.
Yeah. Thank you.
It would be like killing all of the grass in your yard and then just hoping that killing all the plants in your yard and hoping that the grass is going to grow back up before the weeds do. Like that was kind of my experiment this year and it didn't work. We have a yard full of weeds right now.
All right. Well, this question is for anybody. If anybody there is excited about these new tools, what could a member of the public do to make sure that this research progresses to the point where it could actually be implemented and potentially funded? What could an average Lake Association member do, or maybe even a student?
Is this for me?
It could be for anybody who wants to take a stab at it.
Well, maybe I'll start with the students. We always have openings in the summer to hire seasonals, and we hire a lot of several undergrads every year. So that's one option. And then in terms of lake residents or citizens, I think I would suggest reaching out to the watershed districts first, or watershed management organizations to see what's going on, because there may already be something in the works. And if that's the case, then and if we are involved, also us can find, a useful things for the residents to do. And there is really several opportunities, but I think the first step would be just reaching out to whoever is in charge of managing your local lakes.
Thank you. Nick, I saw you unmuted.
Yeah, I would just add really quickly, I think it's important too for a narrative to shift a little bit here and see the management of common carp as a water quality strategy. So that conversation is a little bit disconnected. We're doing so much work on improving water quality in lakes and rivers, and then in many situations ignoring the carp problem. So I think it's important that folks can connect those dots and then reach out to their watershed district or SWCD and see what options they might have or what might be in the works.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to say that, first of all, anybody who's at the NASERC showcase is already way ahead of the curve in terms of doing their part, because you're getting informed, you're aware of what's going on, specifically regarding genetic biocontrol. These technologies are not being developed in a silo, but there's a lot of public outreach and engagement and engagement of regulators to make sure that our lakes, our waterways are public resources. It's actually harder to get an approval for a genetic technology in a public resource than it would be a genetic medicine, for example, because a medicine, the individual patient has consent to say whether they want to take it or not. But to release something into a lake, you kind of need broad public support. And so, we live in a world that everyone's aware there's like the sense-making capability of our population is a little bit broken, in that with social media and internet, you can have people with really strong viewpoints that are kind of at an extreme having an oversized impact on the messaging and the dialogue. And so I would encourage everyone to keep coming to showcases like this, keep talking to experts, and to kind of refine your scientific skills to be able to take data and information in and weigh it, and so that you don't become overly influenced by a very small point of view with a loud microphone.
Thank you. Well said. Well, it's 4 o'clock, so I want to, stick to the schedule. The poster session is beginning shortly, so check your email. You'll get even your spam, perhaps. I don't know what your filters are set, but check your email. You'll have the links to all the sessions. There's some talks that are specifically following up on what you heard about today, so check that out. And then I'm going to put my email into the chat. MASERC, I'll be working with SHMIC quite a bit in the coming months. We're going to really be ramping up our outreach and engagement about common carp management. So if you are interested in getting involved in these discussions, if any of this today was interesting to you, you want to stay posted, you want to get more active, please drop me a line. It's just starting to take shape, but you'll be hearing a lot more about carp research in the near future from MASERC. So thank you so much, panelists. That was really great. Appreciate all the amazing work and being here on the discussion today. And thank you all for attending. Thanks for your good questions.